Game of the Year lists are a different beast than music lists, I feel. Songs especially feel tied to a specific year, while games, not so much. And songs are usually around 2 to 5 minutes long, give or take. Games, on the other hand, can range from an hour to 100 or more, which ultimately means I don't have time to play every single game I want to in a given year. It feels way more useful to catalog my favorites of the games I did play in the past year, regardless of their release date. Though, literally every game on this list was released no earlier than 2019, so none of these are particularly retro either. Anyways, this list is only roughly ordered, so don't put too much stock into these placements. Every game here is great and worth your time regardless. But first, let's kick things off with a few honorable mentions for games I enjoyed but didn't fully love. An adorable little gem of a game, one half Metroidvania, one half rhythm game. The former half is solid. The physics and platforming can be a little jank, and the abundance of puzzles towards the end can get a little exhausting, but the rhythm games are really where it's at, and they get surprisingly challenging towards the end to boot. It's got a sweet little story, some wonderful animations and tunes, and most importantly, birds! Birds are just fantastic. This is literally just Ace Attorney, but with nonogram puzzles. That's the entire game. I love Ace Attorney, and I like nonogram puzzles. I unfortunately like nonogram puzzles a little bit less after this game because, honestly, while the story itself is strong and the concept is pretty well executed, there's just far too many puzzles, to the point where I was exhausted by the end. Though in part, that's because I played through all the bonus puzzles. If my only complaint that there's too much of a game though, I mean, that's barely a flaw. This is a weird one because I really wasn't too enamored by it on my first playthrough. It's basically a modern Sonic adventure game with some combat thrown into the mix, and even some exploration elements, and, well, both the combat and the exploration feel like they get in the way of the platforming. But replaying the game over and over to master the levels, and especially going after the time trials, made me really grow an appreciation for how damn cool it is at its core. Just hope the sequel learns from this one's growing pains. The classic you play as the villain type game, though in this case, one of the villain's underlings, after the hero's been defeated. This one ends up having a surprisingly deep plot that I won't spoil, and aside from that is a pretty enjoyable mix of 2D Metroidvania and a Paper Mario style RPG. Much more enjoyable than the actual Paper Mario game that came out last year for what it's worth, and it's a pretty diverse and consistently enjoyable experience throughout, though its platforming elements do wear a little thin by endgame. This game is kind of dumb in its presentation, but charmingly so. It presents itself as a first-person Metroidvania, and while those are both definitely elements of the game, what stands out even more are how many different puzzles the game crafts around its fairly simple gameplay mechanics. Yeah, the game can feel a bit overwhelming at times in its size, and the combat is not good, but it's enjoyable from both a progression standpoint and a completion standpoint. And the DLC, which I just played recently, was quite fun as well. Honestly, it kind of pains me to put this in the honorable mentions and not on the list proper, but I can't quite say this lived up to the original. In part because it feels a bit over-designed. Every ability from the original is back, alongside a bucket load of new ones, including a fair bit of redundancy. And I'm not sold on the combat here either, clearly going for a Hollow Knight type experience and not fully hitting that mark either. But I mean, it's still goddamn beautiful, controls wonderfully, and has some fantastic platforming and exploration regardless. Ooh, this one I was considering for the list proper would have given y'all a cool top 6 instead, but I ultimately kept it off because it did take me a while to get into this one. It's essentially an open world investigation game, coalescing in a Danganronpa style trial. The lore itself is fascinating. The characters in the game's style are fantastic, and while the ending is not fully satisfying, it's serviceable. The gameplay isn't amazing and can be a bit exhausting in places, but I can't say I've ever played a game quite like it either. Alright, and with those out of the way, let's get to the list proper. These are the top 5 best games I played in 2020, starting with number 5. One of the most expansive and deep puzzle games I've played in a while, Filament takes quite a few pages actually from The Witness, in both building a massive number of puzzles around one single mechanic, in this case wrapping a wire tied to your back around poles, and places those puzzles within an interconnected overworld, in this case an abandoned space colony with only one survivor aboard. And it's like The Witness in, well, at least a few other ways I can think of, but I'm not gonna spoil either game here.
Introducing our little breakfast club to you. The headmaster, if you will, was Canary.
The end goal of solving these puzzles is to unlock the bridge of the ship and rescue the lone survivor, who converses at you, though not with you, throughout the game. On top of that, solving puzzles and exploring the environment will reward you of codes to access each of the crew's communication logs, which help you piece together what exactly happened to the ship, as well as familiarize yourself with each of the game's rather fleshed out main cast. The characters and lore are all quite compelling and serve as motivation to keep pushing through, even as the puzzles get devilishly difficult. Like, yeah, this game gets quite difficult with its puzzles, introducing at least a dozen different twists on the main mechanics, mixing and matching them in unique ways, upping the complexity of any individual puzzle type without making the scope unreasonable. It's such a smooth difficulty curve that it kept me racking my brain for hours at a time, never quite feeling exhausting, even with so many puzzles to solve. And while I don't think it's perfect gameplay-wise or story-wise, slight spoilers, but the game's ending is fairly weak, the experience as a whole was easily among the most fun I had this year, and one of the most satisfying to finally conquer in the end. Number 4. Of all the games on this list, this one might be the hardest so, and admittedly, I basically ended up playing this on a whim, barely even knowing much about it, other than that it looked great and promised a compelling narrative, and boy howdy does it deliver on both of those fronts. Essentially, this is a game about archaeology, visiting abandoned sites, learning the world's history, in a setting just foreign enough to both feel familiar and yet very alien at the same time. Like, the world is a bunch of floating islands that drift in a tangled mass of space rivers. That's already cool enough on its own. But then there's this whole history of technology vastly different from anything that exists on Earth, an entire language of consistent hieroglyphics and grammatical rules to the code, and just so much lore to unearth at each of the various sites. And the islands that are populated are all full of character too. The college Aaliyah calls home, the isolated farming village, the big, bustling, maze-like city, the spacious, crowded marketplace. The architecture and the characters within each location are all great. And the way the game progresses is so natural in its non-linearity. You can have a vastly different path to the main story just based on conversational choices, discoveries at each site, hell, even the order you visit sites. It's honestly really fascinating how well it all works. Though the magic does wear off a little on replay, but it doesn't mean that first time through wasn't fantastic. I can still absolutely recommend this one on the basis of how unique and effective it is at crafting a cohesive, compelling archaeological narrative in a way that I've never quite seen before. Number 3. Ooh, here's one I've already mentioned before. Honestly, I was worried about this one at first because this kind of management sim generally is not my thing, but I was sold well enough on the beautiful art, the premise of sailing around the ship of the dead, keeping each of the spirits happy before they depart for good, the obvious emotional draw of a game like this, especially in 2020, that I figured, hey, I'll give it a shot. I did not expect to get so addicted to the gameplay itself that it almost overshadowed everything else about the game though. Like, the strength of this game is how fast-paced and busy it all feels. You don't stick to any one task for long, every task feels different, and there's a whole juggling act in balancing crafting, cooking, farming, etc., all while tending to up to 5 or 6 spirits at once. Sailing around the vast ocean and visiting the numerous islands, progressing each of the many plot threads slowly but surely, and improving your ship along the way to allow you to start juggling even more tasks and go even more places. Yes, it can be a bit exhausting, but it's got such an engaging gameplay loop that I hardly noticed entire evenings melting away while I played. And I mean, that's not to downplay how strong this game resonated with me emotionally. Most of the characters are likable, and even the ones that aren't, intentionally mind you, are at least interesting, and it hurts every time you have to let one of them go. I won't say it's the game that got to me the most this year, surprisingly enough, more on that in a moment, but the whole package is so damn solid and enjoyable that the emotional reactions it evoked were ultimately just icing on the cake. Really pleasant surprise, this one. Number 2. And here's the other game I've brought up before, albeit much more briefly than Spiritfarer. So, this game is basically just a playable album-long music video. That's it, that's the segment. Next! Nah, but for real, this game is just such an easy sell that I feel like I barely have to say much about it. I mean, you have eyes, you have ears. This game's soundtrack in particular is so strong that, had I played this game in 2019 instead of the first weeks of 2020, it would have been a serious contender for my best albums of 2019 list. It's the perfect soundtrack for the game's gorgeous, colorful, and diverse neon environments and fast-paced action, with an undercurrent of rhythm game mechanics on top of it all. It sounds like a lot, I know, and it might be hard to get a grasp of what the game is just from watching it, but it really is more about the experience than the gameplay itself. But mostly, it is just the music. This is a game about love and heartbreak, sure, but also just a love letter to synth pop in all its incarnations. And really, music in general, about overcoming strife and learning to love yourself, set to one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard in a game, with a very replayable arcade feel to it, and despite its short length, it left such an impact on me that I doubt I'll ever forget it. I'd easily put it among my top 20 games of all time, maybe even top 10. So honestly, it's amazing that any game I played this year was able to top it, and yet, number 1. I ping-ponged back and forth on my top 2, and frankly it's closer to a tie than anything else, but if it comes down to which game gave me the absolute best experience, the one that felt the most important to me this year, yeah, then it has to be Wandersong. For many reasons, both my own experiences, as well as being the subject of my favorite Let's Play this year.
Hey there everyone, this is raocow playing Wandersong.
For the record, raocow is the only Let's Player I still watch, and the only one I need, and even if I can't convince you to play this game yourself, absolutely do go check out his Let's Play. It's fantastic. I haven't actually talked about the game yet though, let me do that. You're a bard and you go around singing all the world's problems better. I mean, that's the game in a nutshell. Or at least, that's what it looks like on the surface, and it's not like that premise ever really changes throughout the course of the game, but... Well, there's so much depth to the story and the characters that I won't even begin to delve into, because it really is best experienced blind, but what this game presents itself as at face value is ultimately not what it delivers, is all I'll say. And it's phenomenal the whole way through, culminating in genuinely one of the most impactful and moving endings I've ever experienced in a game. It's genuinely that fantastic. From the Goofy Bard game, yes. I mean, it helps that the gameplay remains consistently fun and fresh, that the aesthetic is so charming, that the music itself is so good, another game with a love of music at its core, surprise surprise, and it's the perfect lane for what it has to offer gameplay-wise. But it's really the narrative that makes this game as strong as it is, and I'm not sure what else I can say beyond giving my absolute highest recommendation. It really is something special. And that'll be all from me. I hope you all enjoyed this brief delve into my 2020 gaming experience, and hopefully you found at least something that looked interesting. I know my tastes are pretty esoteric, and especially veer almost exclusively towards indie games, but I got a lot out of each and every one of these games, and it'd be awesome to see the developers getting some extra support out of this. I don't know how often I'll be talking gaming, as I don't want to make yet another one of my hobbies into work, but I'm definitely going to keep up at least this yearly summary as a tradition going forward. Anyways, see y'all in the next one.